Hi, everybody, and welcome to New America, New York City. It's so great to have everybody here. Thank you for coming inside on this beautiful evening. My name is Liza Mundy. I'm a senior fellow with New America, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., but very much with offices in New York. And one of our missions is to promote stimulating conversations on a whole range of topics having to do with public policy and public life. And we're really looking forward to our conversation tonight. We have Anu Partanen. Would you just say your name also, please, in your wonderful Finnish way?
Anu Partanen. We
yes.
roll our R's,
yes.
But Partanen is perfect.
Exactly. A Finnish journalist turned naturalized American citizen and the author of The Nordic Theory of Everything, In Search of a Better Life. Her book has just been published and it'll be for sale afterwards, so we hope you will all stay to have a glass of wine and buy a book and get it signed. She has written for the New York Times and the Atlantic and worked as Fortune magazine as a visiting reporter through the Innovation Journalism Fellowship at Stanford University. Seated next to her is Sanjay Reddy, who is an associate professor of economics at the New School for Social Research. He's also a member of the independent high-level team of advisors to the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, working on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and is one of the founders of the Global Consumption and Income Project. And seated next to him is Lou Daly, the Director of Policy and Research at Demos. He previously led the Beyond GDP project at Demos, and he's a member of the Global Wellbeing Lab and an advisor to the Center for the Study of Governance Innovation in South Africa. So we have a lot of students of well-being on the podium, and I hope, therefore, that we can come to some sort of epiphany about how we can all achieve that state. So, Anu, I thought I actually have two questions for you. This will be a free-flowing conversation, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. But I have two questions for you at the start. And I thought I would just ask you first, since people probably haven't read your book yet, since it's recently published. Your argument, I think it's fair to say, is that the American dream is alive and well. It just happens to be living in Northern Europe right now. And I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit on your argument, just sort of lay out what you argue in the book.
So overall, I guess I want to start by saying that I'm not here to say that Nordic countries are perfect or that they have figured everything out. My purpose with the book was I moved to the US 8 years ago. And so when I came here, I was very excited. I had the decision to move, took me a while. The reason was simply that I had met a man who's now my husband. And for 2 years, we actually thought about who's going to move. You know, he could move to Finland, I could move to America. And eventually, for various reasons, for language, for work reasons, we decided that I will move here. But I also wanted to move here because who doesn't want to move to the United States? Everybody wants to. It's the biggest, most powerful country in the world. And everything, I watch TV in Finland, all the products, everything comes from the US. And it's the land of opportunity, the American dream. So, and New York City, of course. Everybody in Europe wants to come to New York City. So I was excited to come here. But fairly soon after I came, I started to just feel very anxious in a way that I had never felt back home. At first, I thought it's just me. I'm sure many Nordics, at least in America, recognize that Americans often think that the Nordics, they're those small socialist nanny states. They pamper their citizens who are almost like children. And so it's only natural that a person coming from a country like that can't handle the big world. And that's what I kind of thought, that, okay, I have to, get a grip and be a little bit tougher. But after a while, I realized that everybody around me was anxious too, that in America, people are very stressed out, very anxious, more so than what I knew back home. And so that got me to thinking about this. And with the book, I really wanted to think about how we could imagine a society for this day and age, like what kinds of solutions and policies we could make that would create quality of life for everyone. And so the American dream aspect comes from, well, various things that I discuss in the book, and we will probably discuss here. But at its simplest, if you look at any studies now, in Nordic countries, people are actually more able to become wealthier or more educated than their parents, which has always sort of been the American dream, the upward mobility, that you have opportunity, that life gets better, that your children will do better than you do. And so this really is not happening in America anymore, and it's happening more so in Nordic countries. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to start looking into it. Why is this?
So this is a sort of a personal question, but one of the thoughts I had as I was reading your terrific book is that in the past 5 or 6 years in the publishing industry, we've had a couple of books that are sort of like the intellectual antecedents to yours that basically show Americans, how great life is in other countries. And we seem to have a sort of masochistic appetite for this. So we have Pamela Druckerman's book called Bringing Up Bébé, which is about, the sweet deal that French mothers have, and particularly working mothers and working parents in terms of, free and available childcare, great maternity leaves. And so we read these books with a lot of enthusiasm. And then another book, a wonderful book that you cite in your book, Amanda Ripley's exploration of education systems in other countries, looking at why education is working better in other countries, the smartest kids in the world, which is also another look at how things are done abroad. And your wonderful book as well, looking at policies even going beyond parental leave, although you talk a lot about that, and free, high quality, accessible childcare, but also the public health system and the education system in Finland really laying that out. And the difference is that somebody like Pamela Druckerman, who's an American journalist, happens to be living in France, living that sweet maternal dream, and you, in sort of a cruel twist of fate, end up writing your book, sketching out this fairyland vision of Finnish kids in their forest kindergartens being picked up, from their wonderful urban homes and taken to the forest and brought back at the end of the day. And it's also great. And yet you're living here. And I just wondered, in the exercise of reporting and writing the book, did you ever think, bad call?
I did. I sometimes did. I'll be honest with you, I don't have kids. If I did, we might be in Finland right now, just because life is so much easier there. If I was thinking about my children, the opportunities they would have, the opportunities I could provide for them, it might make sense. And that is a very sad thing to me, because there are many things that I love about America, and there are many great things. Life here is in many ways wonderful. I don't think Nordic countries are at all, like I said, perfect, and Finland for sure. I mean, it is smaller. I love America for the sheer size of it. It's so energetic. There's opinions about everything. There's all these people from all over the world really live in the United States. So for me, that is all very exciting, and I love to be part of that society. So I think it's a very sad thing that I would have to leave, because I can't afford healthcare or I can't afford daycare here. But in fact, I know many Finnish-American families or Nordic-American families who have lived here and worked here and been very interested and enjoyed the great things about America. Like in many industries, if you want to climb to the top of your career, or if you're an academic, the US is the place to be. In Nordic countries, they have many good things going for them, but it's not like they're necessarily the center of the world. But then they move to Finland or Sweden or back home to Norway when they have kids, because life just is more manageable there.
So I would invite Lou or Sanjay, just thoughts that bubble up that you're having trouble repressing at this point.
First of all, on behalf of my colleagues at Demos, who I know share my great interest in the important ideas we're talking about tonight, I really want to thank New America Foundation for inviting me to be here tonight. And I want to thank Anu for her really, truly excellent book. I'm not winking and nodding at Anu's publicist right now. Go out and buy it. It's really a great mix of hard-headed analytical research, really rich storytelling, and frankly, shot through with a lot of personal candor about your own struggles, which made the book extra appealing for me. So definitely a great book to get, especially like me, if you're like me and you're one of the people in the US who are working to figure out just why we can't figure out the collective part of being individually self-sufficient. this is what Anu describes as the Nordic theory of love, which I think is a really great way to start the book and a really important formulation for us to absorb. And I'm someone who actually has written in the field of sort of comparative welfare states. I've never really read as lucid a formulation of sort of what the Nordic public philosophy is, as is detailed in Anu's book. And basically the idea is that there's a social compact where, contrary to what Americans think about Nordic socialism, that actually prizes individualism and individual autonomy and self-sufficiency as the core of society. But then there's the recognition that for individuals to achieve self-sufficiency, there are collective things that we all need, right? A good education, childcare in order to help young families bring new beings into the world, higher education in order to make the leap into the professions, healthcare, of course, benefits in place for times of unemployment, retirement security. In the Nordic countries, there's an agreement that all individuals need these things precisely to be self-sufficient, and there's an agreement that those societies have to provide those things through the tax system and through government. The problem in the US, which has an equally strong viewpoint of individualism, individual autonomy and self-sufficiency as the primary values, is that we don't seem to understand, and we haven't provided the collective aspects of that, the collective goods that we need to be self-sufficient. And I think one of the criticisms I might have of the book is that you sort of take us to the point of assessing sort of the differences between the US and the Nordic states in this regard. And your assessment is simply that we haven't found a way to agree on how to provide those collective goods that all individuals need. And so for me, as an analyst of the US domestic context, of course, that begs the question as to why haven't we been able to reach a consensus on the provision of those public goods that we all need? And, you know, I have a very complicated answer to that, but the bottom line I would suggest is that unlike in the Nordic countries, we have deep problems around race and racial divides that have fundamentally gotten in the way of the collective side of individual self-sufficiency. So I have more to say about that, but maybe we'll let Sanjay come in, and then we can come back to the question of race.
Right.
Good evening. Thank you so much, Liza and Anu, for your book, and Lou for your comments. Let me just add a few things to what's already been said. I think that Lou is absolutely right that one of the most interesting things in your book is this elaboration, the elaboration that the Nordic point of view is in fact individualist, not collectivist. And you quote another New Yorker, Lars Tragard, my former colleague at Barnard College, Columbia University, who has elaborated that view very persuasively. But I would go beyond what Lou has said, and I think that you hint at this, in that it's not only that the Nordic model provides for individual self-sufficiency, though self-sufficiency is a value, it provides for greater freedom, a larger kind of freedom than would otherwise be available for individuals and also for the society at large. And I would like to just mention here the famous distinction that the philosopher Isaiah Berlin made between negative and positive liberties in his well-known essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. The idea is that the negative liberties involve freedom from interference, and this is something that the United States recognizes and values viscerally. But there's another kind of liberty which has to do with being able to do things effectively. A person who's handicapped but doesn't have the requisite aids or accessibility to be able to enter certain spaces may have negative liberty but not positive liberty. And this is very much the idea, of course, also behind the human development concept, which has been supported and propagandized by the United Nations over the last 25 years or so. And if one applies that lens to the Nordic countries and to the United States, then I think one can go further than speaking of self-sufficiency. One can actually recognize that there is a kind of individual freedom which is made possible. And you give a number of instances of that kind. the ways in which, for example, ordinary citizens in Nordic countries are freed from child care and elder care, which doesn't mean being freed from responsibilities, but being able to shift their responsibilities toward the things that only the family member can provide, which are more loving and tender interactions, as opposed to the day-to-day functional requirements of child care and elder care. And there are many other examples of that kind. I would like to also just mention two other issues, if I may, just to put them on the table for discussion. One of them is the very interesting point that Anu makes about the cognitive load of the American system, the way in which each person in this system has to, on a day-to-day basis, keep in mind a large number of things that have to do with negotiating the health insurance regime, for example, and managing it and battling very often with the health insurance companies. That was one of the very interesting chapters in her book. But it extends to many other domains of life, the managing of retirement, for instance, and education of children and so on. And the freedom from that cognitive load of people in the Nordic countries is part of what gives them a greater individual freedom to do the things that are important for them in their life plans and individual circumstances to be able to do. There is a recent literature in economics which focuses on the cognitive load of poverty, the idea that people who are in poverty have to spend a lot of time and energy effectively trying to survive, and that this makes it more difficult for them to do various things that they otherwise ought to be able to do to bring themselves out of poverty. I think that that literature is partially convincing, but Anu's argument, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it in the Indian rather than the Finnish way, because it's a name in both
the same
societies, is that I think this problem is much more general. It's not just to do with poverty, it's to do with institutions. And to the extent institutional arrangements can free people from that sort of a load, that is a very desirable thing to do. And of course, as she very much underlines, Nordic societies are not ones that interfere with people's negative liberties on a day-to-day basis. The last point that I would like to make, which is just to get the discussion started, which I think is very important, is that this is not merely a value framework, a perspective as to what it is that's desirable in a society or in an individual life. I think one can also make a very powerful argument that the Nordic type of institutional regime is in the interest of economic prosperity. And I think this is an argument which is perhaps a little bit hidden in the book, so I would like very much if she could speak to this question. But once again, there is a very interesting and important academic literature which emphasizes this point, and institutional literature coming out of international organizations and so forth. Let me just give you one or two examples. Many people have pointed out that the way in which the Nordic system protects people by providing them with a strong basic safety net, and of course it's not just the Nordic countries, but countries elsewhere, many countries in the world, facilitates risk-taking. It facilitates entrepreneurship at the individual level. It facilitates skills development, what are called firm-specific skills, for example, are something that people can more rationally invest in the Nordic system, because they know that if they lose their position in a particular company or industry, they will still have the safety net to fall back on. And this is a very important principle or factor, therefore, from an economy-wide and society-wide point of view in fostering innovation. And indeed, we do see that the Nordic countries are highly innovative. Anu's own country, Finland, despite the recent difficulties of Nokia, is an example of that in terms of the way in which certain innovative industries have played a leading role. And another example that one might provide, which is a little bit more esoteric, but arguably was very important historically, is that because the Nordic countries had a compressed wage structure, pushing up the wages of people at the bottom, and to some degree pushing down the wages of people at the top through collective bargaining in particular, this created an incentive for firms to undertake innovations which would allow them to save on expensive labor, especially on using people in relatively unskilled roles, and rather to deploy them in more skilled roles, which is an argument that's been put forward by the Norwegian economist Kalle Mune very persuasively. So these are a couple of examples, and I think there are many more that could be presented to really bring out that the Nordic model is not just desirable from a value perspective, but it's also desirable from the point of view of economic prosperity, productivity, effectiveness, and is, contrary to some arguments, actually economically sustainable.
Anu, did you have any response to any of the points that
Yes,
were
I
floated,
think
or just
I rest my
thank,
case. The gentlemen have.
Thank your publicist for
Yes, they have clearly read my book, which is wonderful. Yeah, so I guess I could just comment on what Lou was saying about why Americans have not been interested in this model or often dismiss it offhand. I think race and diversity are definitely, let's talk about them. They are important questions and really interesting, and I always get asked about them. But I think everything you are saying now and that I wanted to do in the book was that I think that in America, the point of view has so strongly been that these kinds of policies that Nordic countries do are socialist, are collectivist, are about charity to the poor. That's the American idea. I mean, I was just talking to an American acquaintance who now teaches at a university in Finland, and she said that often they have international lectures in Finland with international students, and when Americans are there, she actually had been asked, why do you Nordics love your poor so much? And she was like, and that is my book's point, that I think that's a mistaken view of what the sort of Nordic idea is. And when I say Nordic idea, I mean that the idea that we should use government in a smart way to provide certain basic services for everyone, services that, like discussed here, everybody needs for equality of opportunity, for freedom, for the most American of values, for the individual independence. And if you provide them as a universal service, everybody gets healthcare, everybody gets daycare, affordable daycare, everybody gets a good education. After that, you can sort of let people do what they want to do, and everybody really has equality of opportunity. And this provides in many ways freedom and independence within families. In the US, family has traditionally, and even today, is still the safety net. And people in families are very dependent on each other in ways that was surprising to me when I moved here. And I love my family. Everybody in Nordic countries love their families. My point is not that, oh, this is a bad thing that families are close. But for equality of opportunity, it's not a great system where a child's future is decided whether their parents can navigate the school system or offer a house in a good public school district or a private school, or whether their parents can arrange for health care. I mean, these are things that in America people are very actually dependent on their circumstances. The Nordic countries have aimed to provide these for everyone, which gives everyone, I think, more freedom, more opportunity. And what Sanjay was saying about the amount of time that Americans have to spend in arranging these things, this was to me crazy. I mean, time is money too. Time is quality of life. And it requires so much effort for everybody to individually do this. So in many ways, it actually imprisons people. And I think in America, this point of view has not really been discussed at all. And I really hope that my book would help to rethink this. But I would think that's one of the reasons why people often so strongly feel like, well, we don't want it here. That's not the society we want, because they've really thought about it only from the point of view that, oh, it takes away people's money, it takes in taxes money from some and gives it to the others, and some have to suffer for the good of others, instead of thinking that this is actually for the good of everyone, and everyone benefits. I mean, Nordic people are not crazy. They're not with this system against their own interest. Most people really like this system because they feel like it gives them the ability to do what they want, the opportunities, the life choices, and just the time to focus, like Sanjay was saying, focus on their family in other ways than just trying to work hard enough to be able to make enough money to pay for daycare.
Yeah, I thought, just to pick up on one of the things that you said, one of the aspects of American life that you really tease out by being sort of a stranger in a strange land that really struck home to me was this idea that we have all these dependencies baked into our system in a way that we take for granted. So the idea, you talk, and maybe this resonated with me because I'm the parent of teenagers and children in college, that, you know, that in Finland at 18, you really are independent from your parents, that you know, your school is, your parents are not going to have to pay for your higher education, so you are independent, whereas we have this prolonged enforced dependency. If you're fortunate enough to be going to college or university, and if your parents can pay for some or all of it, then you have this prolonged period of dependency on your parents that doesn't necessarily exist. And also, just one other example you talk about, which is the healthcare system, the idea that in, say, a marriage, one person, you're so desperately dependent on having health care that one person might keep a job that they don't necessarily want in order to keep the health care. And so that person is dependent on their employer, and the other person in the partnership or marriage is dependent on that other person. Just the sort of invisible enforced dependency. We think of ourselves, again, as so individualistic and so independent, and yet there are all these factors that are forcing us into dependent positions, or, you know, and you also talk about elder care, just our sort of complete lack of any kind of social safety net in that regard. Again, you become dependent on your family members if you're lucky enough to have them. So, Lou, do you want to just sort of elaborate on, you know, the inevitable question that we have when we talk, and particularly about Northern European countries, is, you know, why can't we get there, whether we could ever get there, whether in this presidential campaign maybe we'll get there in some small way and have a little bit of paid parental leave, a couple weeks. Do you want to elaborate on your thoughts about why we haven't gotten there, and
Sure. Yeah,
whether it's changing?
Okay. So you address one of the sort of reasonings why can't the U.S. be like the Nordic states, and people often say, well, the Nordic states are culturally homogeneous, so it's easy to build consensus when everyone looks the same, right? The U.S. is, of course, much more diverse. We're already, I think, only 62% non-Hispanic white. By the mid-2040s, we'll be majority non-white. Right. So that answer to me is sort of a red herring, because diversity literally is just about skin color, and skin color isn't a social fact. I mean, it isn't a biological fact, it's a social fact, right? The problem is that our diversity entails a socioeconomic hierarchy, right? And it entails all kinds of institutional embodiments of some people being valued more than others. And so our diversity becomes very, not in and of itself the problem, but the way it's constructed is the problem. And, you know, I don't need to give a history lesson, but unlike, say, the Nordic states, the U.S., I mean, the contradiction that the founding of the world's oldest democracy is a byproduct of one of the most violent examples of settler colonialism. That contradiction is with us today. It's with us in Ferguson, it's with us in Baltimore, it's with us in Chicago, it's with us in Cleveland, it's with us in Staten Island, and it's taken different forms over the years. Now, the interesting thing is that we do have a welfare state, but it's submerged, and it's mainly designed to benefit middle-class white people, right? So when progressive colleagues fighting back against sort of the Republican mantra that government hurts the middle class, and we say, no, we built the middle class. Social Security and the GI Bill and federal home mortgage assistance. Well, all of those policies were racially exclusionary. What we actually built was the white middle class. What happened, however, when Lyndon Johnson came in the 1960s and the civil rights movement, we began to universalize the welfare state through different varieties of affirmative action, through fair housing policy, even through the Clean Air Act, which had its greatest impacts in our cities. And that's when you have this huge backlash against government. When you're trying to push a partial welfare state designed to help the white middle class become a truly universal welfare state, such as you have in the Nordic countries. And so ever since then, government has become the projection screen for racial resentment. Similarly, business, of course, anti-government to get rid of regulation. And so you have in today's Republican Party a kind of composite of business anti-government and racially resentful anti-government, and that has been at the center stage of our politics since the 1970s, and it's that sort of stranglehold, not just on policy, but on the very idea of government that's really preventing us from being able to build a consensus around certain types of government programs that, in fact, we all need to be self-sufficient.
Just add one word to that. I tend to agree with Lou that there's a great deal of exaggerated belief that building shared institutions, and in particular those that have well-being state characteristics, to borrow Anu's excellent term, not welfare state, but well-being state, requires homogeneity of societies. Well, what are the homogeneous societies that you know? Is Korea a homogeneous society? It turns out that regionalism in South Korea is enormously important in politics. There are all sorts of contests that involve people from different regions wanting to be more represented and to have a larger share and so on. And there's a stigmatized ethnic minority in Finland, namely the Swedes, as some of you may know, maybe not so stigmatized, but it is a minority. And the examples can be multiplied. So much of what we view as homogeneity is very superficial, in fact. And the idea that these are homogeneous societies actually emerged from the success of the well-being state projects and the nation-state building projects which took place historically. And of course, the United States has a very specific history in that regard, and I think Lou's entirely right about the role of race in this connection. But perhaps it's not only race, it's also the fact that this is a society of mass immigration, historically in the 19th and early 20th century, which posed particular challenges. There were things like prairie socialism in Canada and the United States, both, which emerged. But it's difficult to construct a movement of fellow feeling and a movement for shared institutions, arguably in those conditions. But whatever the reasons are, I think that today the most powerful argument one can and should make is that the lack of a well-being state is now a drag on economic productivity. In fact, that very left-wing institution, the International Monetary Fund, in a report that it released last week on the United States, identified 4 risks to the United States' future prosperity, one of which was poverty, and another of which was inequality, both of which the IMF believes are impeding the ability of the United States to undertake necessary investments in human capabilities which will enable its population to be productive in the future. And let's also add entrepreneurial. If one is relying on only a part of one's population to have the ideas and to staff the leading edge corporations or institutions, then of course one will be operating at partial strength as a result. So much as race may be important, and has been important historically, I think that there are effective ways to make the argument. And I think that rather than counterposing the full-fledged well-being state against what exists, we should think about experiments of various kinds that can advance the agenda partially and show what is possible and that it can work. I was finally, and I'll just end with this in this round of comments, very struck by Anu's observation, which of course other people have made as well who've moved to New York State and New York City, which has relatively high taxes, that the tax rate is not very different from what it is in Europe. And yet one gets rather less for those taxes. And one could very reasonably therefore ask the question, where is it going? And the most obvious answer to that, in addition to the corporate welfare state, not well-being state, but welfare state, and other such tax expenditures in the United States, or outright expenditures, is of course military spending, which demonstrably is much more important in the United States than elsewhere. And so I think the United States really has to ask the question whether the kinds of military spending that it undertakes are now getting in the way of the well-being of its own people. And this is not to say that the United States should not play a role in providing peace and security, but whether it's quite doing so in the right way and it's making the right bargain is a question that I think Americans must ask today.
Do you see that question being asked?
Not enough. I think perhaps because people don't appreciate exactly what the trade-off is.
Right.
Great points, obviously, and I would want to comment on the economics question. I think it's absolutely true, and I discuss in the book how so many studies and so many international organizations talk about this, how this is very good for the economy. It's good, and the one thing that I often also get in a question asked about Nordic countries is sort of, some people come to me and they're like, well, of course you can have all these things because in Nordic countries people work. In America they do not work. As a Nordic person, I often find this quite ironic because I think Americans who have jobs work a lot more than, or longer hours than Nordics, so I don't think that's fair. But this is based on the part of working age population that is actually employed. And it is true that in Nordic countries this is either the same or higher than in the US. But from the Nordic point of view, it's these policies that help people to work. It's not that we first work and then we can give these policies. Of course, the system relies on people working and paying taxes, and then with those taxes we're paying these things. But daycare helps single parents to work, affordable daycare. I mean, in America, a lot of parents just cannot work because they cannot afford daycare. Having a good education helps you get a good job and helps you work. Parental leaves help women work. I mean, they might stay home longer, for sure, than a lot of American women do for a while, but then they have their job waiting for them, and they don't have to quit their job if they want to take care of their children. The policies that Nordic countries have designed around parental leaves to encourage men to also take time off help women work as well, and women advance in their careers. So a lot of these policies are actually very good for getting people to be employed and allowing them to work. So that's one of the things that I think definitely is also often not necessarily appreciated in the US. The diversity question, I think the history is absolutely described correctly here, and racism is of course a big reason why people also act against their own interests, because they feel like, I don't want to share or cooperate with these people here. I have few observations about that. I think Nordic countries today are much more diverse than people think. I mean, Sweden is a very diverse country today. It has more foreign-born residents population, bigger percentage of foreign-born people in its population than the US does. They have taken immense amounts of immigrants in, and they still believe in these policies. People haven't decided that, oh, we don't want this anymore now that there's more immigration. I also find it interesting if we're going to talk about what could be done in America, and I think a lot of these logistical issues, these policies are already handled by the states or cities in the US. So there's all kinds of initiatives that I think are very promising. And many of them happen in California and New York, which are one of the biggest, most diverse states in the United States. Both these have initiated their own paid parental leave schemes. Paid sick days in California required minimum wage raises. So some of the, in this regard, most progressive states are actually most diverse. So certainly racism or race can stop people from doing this, but in the US too, there are plenty of areas where people see the benefits and are not discouraged by the fact that, oh, we have, diversity here.
U.S. cities as well. I mean, in terms of paid leave, it is the cities these days where the initiatives, or as you said, a few states that are among our diverse states. Yeah. So one of the most interesting moments early on in your book is when I think it's that you're trying to negotiate your cable bill, or you're trying to figure out like how much you might have to pay from this sort of corporate double talk that you're getting about fees, and you talk about experiencing for the first time anxiety. Like the anxiety that how much is it going to be, and will I be able to afford this, and are you going to be able to inflate it, and I have to ask, like, before that moment, growing up in Finland, had you really never experienced anxiety? Like, what's it?
Not over these same questions.
Yeah,
I had, of course, for other reasons, but not because I all of a sudden felt like I don't understand what's going on here. I went to the doctor for the first time. It was an ordeal to figure out how to get insurance, health insurance, because I'm a freelancer, my husband was a freelancer. It was already difficult and anxiety producing. Then I went to the doctor just for a regular checkup for the first time. It was wonderful, the doctor was wonderful. And later, a letter comes from the insurance company saying that, oh, this test wasn't covered. And I look at it and I ask myself, how was I supposed to know this? Was I supposed to, every time the doctor touches me, be like, oh, don't, is this covered? What are you doing? And my husband was like, well, maybe. But obviously the doctors don't know. They can't tell me in that moment if this is covered. And so these kinds of things that may seem minor in the situation, maybe the bill wasn't, I can't even remember, it was probably $100, but they create this sense that all these things are coming at me and I'm being charged for this and charged for that, and I don't know. I have no way of being a rational person here and deciding what I want to do. And I hadn't experienced that, I think partly because Nordic countries have more sensible consumer protections and laws that sort of regulate what the companies are supposed to be doing or what they can do and how clear they have to be in informing you. But partly, of course, because healthcare, which of course is a gigantic question, and all countries struggle with how to, in this day and age, arrange healthcare because the prices are rising everywhere. But in Finland and in Nordic countries, healthcare is provided through taxes. Most doctors are salaried employees the same way as in America public school teachers are, or firemen or the police. And so you go to the doctor, a bill might come, but it is very clear. You can go and take a look in Finland that in all countries the maximum amount any hospital can charge as co-pays is 30 euros for a night at the hospital. And then maybe something comes for the lab test, but you know that you can in advance see it, and it's not every doctor doesn't charge you separately, hospital doesn't charge you separately. So it's much more clear, it's easier to understand, and overall, so you feel more in control of your life, and you don't have to spend so much. I think the cognitive question is so important, so much energy goes into trying to figure these things out.
Right.
And I really hadn't experienced that before, for other reasons, sure.
And you make that point about U.S. tax forms also, that trying to do your taxes,
yes.
you know, yeah.
I mean, yeah. I know that Americans probably won't believe this, but I miss my Finnish taxes.
Yes.
Because it's so simple. They send you a form, everything is there. You look at it, you're like, okay, looks okay. I don't do anything. Or if something needs to be corrected, I put a line. I was a freelancer in Finland too, so self-employed. Then I did have to send in my expenses later. But the process was so much simpler. And in the US, it's just very hard for me to understand. And I think for most of us, and a lot of people employ accountants. I never employed an accountant in Finland, but I do here, or did at least for a while. And I think that comes to the submerged state question as well, which I talk about in the book too, how in the US studies have been made where people who get various benefits, even Medicare, Social Security, that we think should be fairly clear that this is a government benefit, but also tax credits for child care or other reasons, they don't know that they are getting a benefit that is provided by the government. The researchers go and ask, have you ever used any social program? People say no. Then they ask, have you used this? Have you used that? And most people have. So partly the reason for it, the taxes become so complicated. There's all these deductions that are meant to help families, and that's of course a good thing that they are meant to help families. But the problem with providing them in that way is that taxes become so complicated. Nobody really understands them. Nobody can really calculate like, oh, how much support did I now get for my daycare bill or whatnot. And so it just becomes this burden that also makes it makes it, for me, harder, for example, to understand what my financial situation is. Right. I'm not really clear.
Which induces anxiety.
Yeah,
yes.
Again. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And I do think the cognitive drain research is really important and relevant. There's the complexity of navigating these various systems. And, I mean, does anybody on this panel see any move to change in... We talked about, you know, the green shoots of change. I mean, we talked about some cities that are getting paid leave, you know, very, very kind of small, rudimentary starts. But, you know, if you sort of take as a premise that there is this complexity and this lack of social support and that we have to find our own way to move somewhat closer to some sort of state of well-being.
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely it's bubbling up in cities and states. The federal situation is completely dysfunctional for a lot of reasons, not least money in politics, which is something that's also quite different in the United States than I would imagine in Finland. If we had time, I would ask you, what do you think of this current election compared to, say, the typical election in Finland, but
I don't think we got that.
we'll save that for the comedy hour.
Yeah, for the Q&A.
with the
Yeah,
wine.
sure. Yeah. So prepare your answer.
But definitely, I mean, and cities and states have always been the laboratory of democracy,
Yeah.
so it feels like we're going through another cycle of that,
Yeah.
and that's great.
I don't have very much to add on this point except to note that if New York State were a country, presumably it would have very different institutions in this regard. So obviously there are different points of view in the United States, and that's at the crux of the problem. But I would just like to recognize that Anu is in a great tradition of foreign, now American, analysts of the United States. Of course, Alexis de Tocqueville is the most famous such figure from the first half of the 19th century. And it's extremely important that such comparisons emerge from people like her, because it's only in that way that one can possibly understand this society. It's very easy to think that the United States is exceptional, and it is exceptional in many respects. But even its exceptionalism, or the respects in which it is so, can only be understood through such comparison. And I think that there's a whole debate which is pointed to, and a research program as well, to try to understand exactly what is and is not transferable, and what requires specific prior histories to support it, and what doesn't. And one of the examples that I think is very interesting for Americans to think about is what is called flexicurity in regard to the Danish system, but I think the Nordic system generally, the combination of flexibility and security. This is another false opposition that very often we have in the economic policy debate. Not only is it possible to combine flexibility and security, it's necessary in order to achieve certain kinds of economic outcomes, because of the problem of portability of benefits, for instance, that keeps people tied to certain kinds of jobs which may not be the best jobs for them, and for that matter, they may not be the best match for their employer, and it leads to less vitality in the economic system than there otherwise could and should be. There's a lot more to say, but maybe I'll stop there.
Well, I'll just finish by saying I love your intellectually. I mean, I love thinking of de Tocqueville and the wonderful intellectual tradition of people coming from abroad to look at and think about our country. I had a much sort of more lowbrow analogy. But I'm also very grateful. You know, they say that, the old cliche that if you put a frog in boiling water, you know, the frog will jump out. But if you put a frog in water, then you just slowly turn up the water, then the frog will stay in and get boiled. And I feel like, you know, so often in our course of our daily life, we're just sort of, we've been slowly boiled. And so we get used to the healthcare bills and the tax forms and scrambling for daycare and, you know, and part-time work and people who are having to take 2 buses to get to their jobs. And we just think that it's the norm. And so it is always, you know, important and refreshing to have somebody come and say, oh, the water's boiling, you should just jump out. So with that lowbrow analogy, I'll open it up to questions that will hopefully be on a higher intellectual level than that. I can't actually see, so I can't, the lights are such that I can't see that well, but I'll try.
The Economist did an article last week about the Nordic countries, and one thing that they noted was that Swedish Americans have half the poverty rate of the overall population. And isn't one reason that a better social safety net can work in Scandinavia is because there's less of the population that would be prone to abusing it?
I think there's often this, I mean, it often becomes this question that is there something unique about Nordic countries or Nordic people or their culture that allows this to happen? I don't really think so. I mean, I think that there are countries like Canada that is very diverse, sort of different history than Nordic countries, that uses much more similar policies. Other countries maybe don't have all the same policies, but universal health care is in every developed country in the world except the United States. Paid leave. Yeah. The United States and Papua New Guinea are the two countries in the world, not just developed world, in the world, out of 185 countries that the UN looked at, that everybody else offers paid parental leave. So I think Nordic countries have sort of created this combination of all these policies that works well, but a lot of other countries have chosen to at least take bits and pieces, even though they have very different histories. I've heard before sometimes people kind of say that, oh, the states where you have Nordics in the US too, function better. Maybe it's because they're white people. I mean, they don't have the history of maybe the problems that people of color have had, and then the states have been different and the fights have been different. I can't speak to the American history that clearly, but I think, various reasons could be possible. But I don't personally think that there's something so unique about Nordic culture or Nordic people or the qualities of these countries that they're the only places where this would work.
Yeah, and just to follow up, one of the kind of most interesting facts when you look at the comparative welfare state income measures, the U.S. we're thought of as sort of unfettered capitalism compared to socialism, and therefore our much higher levels of inequality are due to this sort of ultra-liberal kind of capitalism that we have. Actually, if you look at the Gini coefficient, which is the measure that is typically used to measure inequality, the U.S. is actually on a pre-tax basis, on a pre-government basis. In other words, the inequality that's generated by the market before government gets involved. The U.S. is actually in the middle of the pack of the OECD. It's far less unequal than, say, Germany or Italy, let alone the United Kingdom. So the inequality story isn't quite what it seems. Where the US shoots to the top of inequality is after government, right? So the problem is not our unfettered markets, it's the fact that our government doesn't do enough to help people deal with the volatilities of markets. And so I think that's a big factor that needs to be understood in terms of people's abuse of a welfare system where that is, in fact, vastly underfunded, and the benefit structures and so on are extremely meager. And I don't know if you mean sort of corrupt abuse of the welfare, like someone actually defrauding the welfare system, or that a person who applies for a social benefit, is that what you would consider to be an abuse? Well, I think there are huge questions of structural unemployment and deindustrialization. We could go into that make it a much more complicated story than a simple question of abuse.
Well, and the question of choosing not to work when you could. I mean, studies show that many mothers, for example, if they can't afford childcare, if their wage isn't going to be enough to cover the expenses of daycare, then they're choosing to stay home when in fact they might prefer to be working, just because they don't have the available social safety net to.
The percent of Americans on disability have been steadily increasing.
Well, yeah.
So, you can go to the doctor.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. No, disability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I wonder if you would comment on a difference you mentioned briefly, but I think deserves perhaps more discussion, and that is the relative size of the United States in terms of population versus the Nordic countries. I think there's a huge difference between a country with a population of, I think, 350 million and a country with a population of 5 million. There's an issue of scale there. And I would think that a smaller country in terms of population would be much easier to manage, be much easier for the government to be effective, say, in the school system, whereas in the United States it would be much harder. And the other issue with size is one of trust. You mentioned a social compact, and with a smaller country and at least till recently, much less diverse country, I would think it would be easier to create trust and to have a social compact. Whereas the United States is wildly diverse to the point of being polarized. And it's not just in terms of race. I don't think anybody trusts anybody. And you just have to look at some of the recent election speeches to see that in action. So I wonder if you would comment on the issue of scale and manageability and also trust.
Well, I could say of the size, I've certainly thought about that too, and it's a completely fair point. I often think that partly the distrust that Europeans have towards EU is in some ways is similar than Americans have to federal government. Completely understandable. They're far away. You're not really sure what they're doing for us. Are they doing anything for us? Are they elite that we're paying for and they're just sort of taking money from us and dividing it among themselves? I think it's a really fair question. But I also think that a lot of these policies, like I mentioned earlier, are run by the states or can be run by the cities. And I actually looked at the numbers, and there are 30 states in the US that have smaller population than Finland. So if they wanted to, I mean, I know that a lot of things, maybe it would be best to run them through the federal program like healthcare. It might be difficult if every state has very different system. But, you know, they could in education, and states have differences and they run things somewhat differently. So I think that would be one thing that you could do. I would also say that what goes also for what I was saying about diversity, that New York and California are places that are actually doing not immensely similar things that Nordic countries are doing, but taking steps towards that, and they're, you know, big states in terms of population. So I'm not sure if it is as decisive a question as it seems on the surface. I think also the federal government runs programs that people like. Medicare and Social Security run reasonably well, and most people are pretty happy with those. So certainly federal government can do things also that work well. Trust, I think it's a really interesting, complicated question. But in fact, I think in Nordic countries there is certainly trust, but people also, like people elsewhere, have very different opinions, very different views of many questions. Today, they're just as polarized in many ways. Finns are terrified by the elections, just like here, that people have such disagreements. So it's a question, but I don't know if that's so decisive either, especially if people sort of understand or think about it better, like, oh, this is good for me. It doesn't have to be just about that I want to help the neighbor, or do I trust the neighbor per se.
Could I just come in on this?
Quickly, and then we'll get a question.
So on the question of scale, I think there can be inefficiencies of small scale as well as of large scale, and also inequities. And the local funding of the school system in the United States is an example, which is very apparent to Europeans and also people from elsewhere, that may not be best resolved by federal involvement in educational financing, but it surely might be better to have a higher component of state financing as opposed to local financing of education at the school level. So I think the argument can be run in many different ways. I actually had a former teacher, professor of economics at Harvard, who shall remain unnamed, who wrote an infamous paper called The Optimal Size and Number of Nations, as if that could be calculated. And so I'm not sure that one can determine that. We have what we have and we have to work with it. Similarly, on the question of trust, I think it's an important question. And there are people like Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, two economists, who have been arguing that the right way to think about cooperation is in terms of what they call reciprocal altruism, which is that to say that we actually are rather other-regarding, but we don't like being ripped off, to put it simply. And so if we feel that the other person, after having had a hand extended to them, has bitten it, then we will withdraw cooperation. But our first impulse is to cooperate and to sustain cooperation as long as it's reciprocal. Now, what should one do with that? Should one have enforcement mechanisms that call on people to report cheaters, as has been tried in some places? The difficulty with that is that it tends to be corrosive of the culture of trust, even if it's ostensibly meant to help enforce trust. So another way to approach it from a historical point of view, from a long-run point of view, is to think of the instilling within oneself of the norms of not ripping off others or the system, being self-sufficient and so on, as being something that emerges from what Deirdre McCloskey calls bourgeois values. Right? To the extent that people conceive of themselves as people who are self-reliant, ethical individuals of a certain sort, then that's not going to happen. So one could reverse the causality here, at least in the long-run perspective.
Hello, this is a question for Anu or any one of you that can answer it. So I just want to know, like, how feasible do you think it might be for Americans who want to move to Nordic countries now? And because
To actually move, did you say move?
yes,
Yeah.
like to move, live, and work there and everything. And because I think right now places like Sweden and Finland and Norway in particular might be experiencing sort of an influx of immigrants, and part of that is the refugees. For Finland, an example, they just started charging for universities, I think, this year, which is not something that they've done before. And I think part of that reason is to try to mitigate a lot of the foreigners that are coming in to just uphold their system. And like several months ago, the New York Times had an array of articles about a lot of folks move. Okay, several months ago, the New York Times had an array of articles about folks moving to or coming in illegally to Norway from like the South Asia region. So I just want to know, maybe a couple years ago, it didn't seem that hard if Americans wanted to move there, but do you think their immigration policies just might be a bit more on the fence nowadays because of recent events that are going on and immigrating to those places?
Yeah, I had a little bit of a hard time hearing, but so I think the question was whether immigration policies, changes in immigration policy make it harder to go and study or live in these countries. That's what we would, yeah. Probably, partly. First of all, being a new American, I would like us to be able to work on things here and not have to escape. It would be sad for me. I mean, maybe there are other reasons, family reasons, things why I would move to Finland back, but I would not want to move because life is so impossible for me for basic reasons, or things that in other countries people consider basic rights like healthcare. But to say about immigration, yes, of course, I guess we're all aware that the European situation it's been difficult. All of a sudden, immense numbers of people have come in. In Sweden, 2015 alone, they had 160,000 asylum seekers come in. That would mean like about 5 million people in America related to population. So one of the sad things that we're seeing in Europe now, and in Nordic countries too, is that they're becoming more anti-immigration, and I think that's a problem, and I hope that they will get over it, and that the problems that come with this, I think the problems are real. This is a real challenge of getting all of these people all of a sudden come in, and we have to figure out where to house them and how to arrange everything. And I hope they get over it or manage these questions without it turning into a similar question like in Britain, where basically the Leave EU vote won partly because people were at least told that this will stop immigration and that will solve problems, which probably will not solve the problems. But as far as changes in immigration policies, I know that Finland has been thinking about requiring some sort of tuition from foreign students, but by American standards, the tuition is still very low. I think they were thinking of maybe 1,000 or 2,000 euros. So I think you can still do it. And I'll be honest, if you come from the United States, I'm not an expert on the visa regulations or something, but you probably have a better chance than maybe if you're a refugee seeker staying. So I think it's probably still doable, but I would really like us to work here. Window might be closing, but
you'd
we
like
could
things to
focus
work,
on
yes.
America.
Yes, that's your hope in writing
But the Finnish language is hard. Keep that in mind.
Language is hard.
And I loved your sections also on Finnish complaining, I would like to point out that you don't present everything as rosy and perfect.
Yes,
There's
I think
Finnish
Nordic
and-
countries can be tough for immigrants also for cultural reasons. I don't think cultural reasons are reasons for why they have the policies they do, but cultural reasons, I mean, they have a different social life than the US have. They tend to be, I think in all Nordic countries, but especially in Finland, tend to be much more like smaller circle with family, with the friends they know from college. So I think coming from outside, immigrants often feel like there's no way in unless you already came as a kid or whatnot. And so I'm not at all thinking that they're like, from an immigrant's perspective, the easiest countries to come to.
Well, with that, we need to make a hard stop. I would encourage you all to get a glass of wine if you'd like one, and definitely to buy a copy of the book, and Anu will be signing. So thank you so much for coming, and thanks to our wonderful panelists.